She burned my babies alive, and now she wants to talk about landscaping violations? That stopped everything. Melinda Gratch, president of the Marrow Glen Estates HOA, didn't flinch, but the clipboard in her hand dipped half an inch. Her mouth stayed tight, controlled. Like she hadn't just supervised the removal of the only fireproof structure shielding my kids. The structure was non-compliant, she said, calm as polished steel. We followed protocol. You removed a certified sprinkler mist rig that met NFPA 13D standards. You replaced it with polyurethane stained timber. That's not protocol, Corliss. That's arson in slow motion. I saw it in her eyes then, just a flicker. The moment she realized I wasn't going to grieve quietly, the moment she realized this wasn't over. And if you think HOA boards can get away with burning down lives and calling it a visual enhancement, hit subscribe. Because this isn't just a fight about wood and code. This is about my twins, and I am not done. I'm Elon Myrick. I spent 26 years with the State Fire Investigation Division and 10 more as a forensic arson consultant for federal and private agencies. I've documented every ignition curve from lithium-ion explosions to accelerant-coated timber fires. But I never thought I'd be reconstructing the one that killed my own children, in my own home. Elson and Rovan were just 16 months old, twins, fragile, soft-hearted little storm chasers. They loved the wind more than anything, how it pushed the hanging bells beneath the shade arbor I built by hand. It was our morning ritual. Set them in their stroller under the arbor, crank on the mist system, let them nap while the Nevada heat stayed at bay. That arbor was more than shade. I forged it from tempered steel, salvaged from my father's cabin after the wildfires took it down in 2017. Welded the seams myself, lined the beams with heat-activated mist nozzles, self-triggered at 165 degrees Celsius. It wasn't a visual obstruction, it was a fire-resistant cradle, a safe haven, a promise. Then Corliss Gratch filed a complaint. She said the metal structure disrupted the visual unity of the HOA's sun-bleached palette, said it cast shadows that made other homes look dingy in evening light, wrote up a violation, daily fines. She claimed the shade arbor threatened property cohesion. I appealed, attached schematics, load tests, county permits, and fire code exemptions. She ignored everyone, claimed the board had full discretion under Marrow Glen's beautification charter. Then, without notifying me, she sent a crew while I was out doing a volunteer training at the local fire college. They didn't cap the mist line. They left exposed polysealed timber near a mulch bed. No shielding, no barrier. That evening, the HOA held a welcome summer bonfire just 3 houses down. Against open flame advisories, I came back to 2 bodies under a collapsed frame and a half-melted stroller. I came back to silence. The neighbor who hosted the bonfire apologized, said he didn't know the sparks traveled, that Corliss said the area was safe now. Now she was standing here, clipboard in hand, in the same gravel my kids used to toss in buckets, still quoting bylaws, still dodging blame. There was no malice, she said without blinking, just a misunderstanding of compliance standards. My jaw twitched. Then why'd you forge the fire suppression forms? That did it. The clipboard dropped a full inch this time. I saw the swallow in her throat, the sweat on her temple. I'd built those logs myself, down to the ping intervals. Even uninstalled, those sensors sent final signals. And my server caught every packet. She didn't know that yet. Didn't know I'd already compiled a time-stamped burn progression report. Didn't know I'd pulled neighborhood wind data and overlaid it on a fire spread simulation. But she would. I walked back toward the scorched arbor. One beam still stood. The one with Elson and Rovan carved into the frame. 3 minutes, I said over my shoulder. That's how long it took to burn. You've got less than that to start running. Corliss didn't run. Not yet. She turned, shoulders squared like nothing had just happened. Like my kids hadn't screamed while the synthetic beam she approved combusted in under 60 seconds. She still had that clipboard tucked against her ribs like a shield. I didn't move. If I had, I'm not sure what would have happened. My neighbor, Edric Hallen, stepped halfway into his yard across the street, silent. He wasn't recording, but he was watching. So were others. House lights flicking on behind blinds, garage doors cracked open just enough to peek out. Corliss smoothed her skirt, then took 2 steps toward me. You're grieving, Mr. Myrick. I understand that. But slander against the HOA or myself won't bring your children back. I didn't answer. I just looked at the charred mulch bed. The melted wheel from the double stroller was still embedded in the stone path. She followed my gaze. I suggest you remove that debris. We have a visual code, and it's still in effect. No hesitation, not a flicker of guilt. And that's when I knew. This wasn't incompetence. This was practiced detachment. She'd weaponized procedure so long, she didn't know how to exist without it. I should have seen it earlier. The signs were there. The time she fined the Polinskis for leaving their Halloween decor up past date. The time she blocked the Yamada family's request for a wheelchair ramp because the slope would compromise curb symmetry. The time she denied my Arbor appeal with a 4-line rejection and a printout of an outdated visual compliance map. But this wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about what those rules destroyed, and she had the audacity to act like we were talking about fencing height or mailbox paint. 3 minutes, I repeated. She said nothing. I turned and walked back toward the arbor's remains. The shade beam stood at a brutal tilt, charred along its underside, the beam that still carried their names. My knees cracked when I knelt beside it. I didn't touch the metal, didn't need to. I could still feel its heat from the day it collapsed. Do you know, I said loud enough for Corliss and anyone listening to hear, how long it takes polyurethane to ignite? 32 seconds with direct ember contact. You approved a flammable structure under direct wind corridor conditions, on a red flag day, after removing a mist rig with active suppression systems. More lights turned on. Corliss backed up a step. The silence wasn't empty. It was pressure building behind a wall, the kind that splits communities in half. But not yet. No one had chosen sides yet. That would come later. For now, the board would retreat behind policy. They always do. Corliss would call an emergency HOA session, say she's reviewing procedures, issue a statement full of passive voice and abstract accountability. But she couldn't bury evidence. Not this time. I already had the backup pings from the mist rig. I built the server that stored the logs. Every signal, every voltage drop, every disconnection pinged back to my home NAS, which updated offsite every 12 hours. The system she ordered removed wasn't just metal, it was memory, and memory had timestamps. A black SUV rolled up and stopped halfway down the block. HOA contractor vehicle. 2 men stepped out. Neither wore uniforms, both looked at the melted remains and then at me. I didn't move. One said something to the other and reached for his phone. I raised my voice. If you or anyone else lay a single hand on this structure before fire inspection is complete, you'll be interfering with a wrongful death investigation under Civil Tort Code. That includes chain of custody violations. They froze. Corliss cleared her throat. Mr. Myrick, please don't escalate. I'm not escalating. I'm preserving evidence. You should know that. You chaired the vote to remove it. And that was the moment she finally looked scared. She turned without another word and walked away. The contractors followed. Across the street, Edric was still standing by his mailbox. Our eyes met. He didn't wave. He just nodded once, and then stepped back inside. Good. Because this wasn't going away quietly, and neither was I. The meeting was held in the clubhouse just 2 nights later. HOA emergency session. Closed discussion, they called it. Except the windows were wide, and every chair scraped and voice carried in the silence. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I stood outside near the hedge, arms folded, watching each board member arrive. Corliss was the last to enter, as usual. She didn't glance at me, but her step faltered as she passed the scorched patch of mulch, still stained black. The beam I'd dragged there, what was left of the shade arbor, stood propped against the clubhouse sign, scorched but upright. A reminder, a marker, a boundary. I counted them as they filed in. 7 board members. 4 with eyes that flicked toward me and quickly looked away. 1 whose mouth tightened, and 1 who paused just before stepping through the door. Darren Colt, Vice President, Civil Engineer. Quiet. He lingered longer than the others, his hand resting on the doorknob, eyes scanning the charred metal beam. Then he looked at me. A long, uncomfortable glance, like someone who knew more than he was supposed to, someone who'd watched it happen from too close. I gave him nothing. just a nod. He gave one back, smaller. Then he went inside. The door closed, but the windows stayed open. Due to recent events, Corliss began, her voice carrying with the confidence of a practice statement, we're initiating an internal review of safety protocols and visual compliance standards. In the meantime, no further construction or structure modifications will be permitted without explicit board approval. A murmur followed, controlled, soft. And about Mr. Myrick? Someone asked. Corliss paused. He's suffered a tragedy. We respect that. But his shade arbor was in direct violation of Articles 14 and 22 of our Property Conformity Charter, and the fire resulted from an unfortunate cascade of weather and unmonitored fire activity unrelated to HOA actions. I exhaled slowly. She was laying the groundwork, prepping the narrative. Unmonitored fire activity, as if it had nothing to do with the unsealed flame pits she greenlit for the HOA bonfire. Additionally, she continued, I want to remind everyone that unauthorized server monitoring of HOA property without board consent is a violation of our digital surveillance policy. We'll be discussing this in closed executive session. That one stung. Not because she was right, but because it showed her hand. She knew about the Mistrig's pings, knew my server caught the disconnection logs, and now she was trying to twist it into unauthorized monitoring. They always pivot when the narrative turns, but not everyone in the room seemed sold. Darren, someone said, a woman near the back. You reviewed the original shade arbor plans, didn't you? The structural analysis? Silence. Then Darren's voice, quiet even. I did. The rig was fully compliant with county safety and wind load standards, fire-resistant materials, custom nozzles. I noted that in the initial file. Corliss cut in. That file wasn't included in the final vote. But it existed, the woman said. A longer silence followed. I leaned against the stone post just outside the window, the cool breeze sliding across the sweat at my collar. I knew that tone in Darren's voice. I'd heard it from witnesses, people who wanted to believe the lie until the truth came for them anyway. Guilt doesn't shout, it whispers. I waited until the meeting ended and the board began filing out. Darren exited third. He didn't rush, didn't avoid me. In fact, he stopped right in front of me and studied the beam like he hadn't spent days trying not to look at it. I reviewed the fire code again, he said. Did you? He nodded. The mist system you installed, was it still active the morning of the fire? Yes. I thought so. He hesitated. His fingers twitched like he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Then his eyes met mine. She ordered the removal herself, he said. No vote, no record. I only found out the day after. I didn't know she replaced it with polyurethane-coated wood. That was the first crack, not an admission of guilt, but enough. Thank you, I said. He nodded and walked away, the weight hanging off his shoulders like something just beginning to form. Inside the clubhouse, Corliss remained seated, speaking to someone on her phone. She hadn't looked outside once, but she would. They came for the shade arbor that night. 2 men in dark hoodies and contractor boots. No insignia, no official vehicle. One carried bolt cutters, the other a power saw. They moved like they'd done it before, quiet, fast, precise. I was waiting on the porch. I didn't speak until they crossed into the yard. You know you're tampering with evidence, right? They froze. The one with the saw glanced around like he expected backup. The other lowered the bolt cutters slowly. We were just told to... Yeah, I know what you were told. I didn't move from the swing. The porch light stayed off. But my camera was already rolling. Motion activated, infrared, synced to my cloud. They backed out, muttering something about wrong address as they crossed the property line. I watched until their taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I checked the alert logs. Camera picked up movement at 2:47 a.m. License plate partially visible. Not a full match, but enough to start cross-referencing contractor tags registered with Marrow Glen Estates. They were getting nervous, sloppy. That wasn't a cleanup job. That was evidence destruction. And Corliss was running out of time. The next morning, a new citation appeared in my mailbox. Unsecured debris violation. Immediate attention required. A photo of the scorched shade arbor beam, same one they'd tried to steal, was attached, circled in red. A warning. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in HOA remediation and fine escalation. They still wanted it gone. Too bad, it wasn't going anywhere. I spent the afternoon logging fire pattern overlays on a topographic blueprint of the property. Temperature acceleration lines matched exactly with the spread direction from the bonfire, not speculative, empirical. The melted edge of the synthetic awning aligned with the burn pattern's origin. Curve. Fire didn't start from inside the yard. It entered from the eastern exposure, carried by wind, exactly where Corliss had permitted the open flames. But the proof wouldn't come from photos and reports alone. I needed something physical, something verifiable. I went to the side shed, the only place untouched by the fire, and pulled out the old mist rig anchor bolts I'd replaced 3 weeks prior. They were still tagged, time-stamped, and heat-treated. I kept them because I don't throw away good steel. Those bolts were my baseline. The new ones, now melted, had been installed with my hands. The differences in metal fatigue, deformation temperature, and fracture angles would prove what kind of thermal event occurred and how fast it escalated. I boxed the originals, labeled them, sent them via overnight courier to Devrin Lawson, my old contact at the state fire marshal's office. The cover letter was simple: possible wrongful death, suspected code violation, ignition pattern matches HOA sanctioned structural modification, initial analysis enclosed, additional documentation pending. Devrin wasn't just a friend. He was thorough, respected, and had no reason to protect anyone in Merrow Glen Estates. I sent the package and walked back inside. That night, the sprinkler line that used to feed the arbor started leaking from the base. Someone had twisted the cap loose. Lyra, my babysitter, noticed it first. She knocked on my door with her hoodie still half-zipped, face pale. "Mr. Myrick, it's dripping again." She stood there barefoot, clutching her phone, screen still open to the Ring app. I followed her to the edge of the yard. Sure enough, a slow bead of water was forming at the old brass coupling where the mist system used to run, just enough to be seen. Someone had tried to open it and failed. That wasn't a leak, that was a warning. I looked at the porch camera feed, nothing on record. Someone had stayed just out of view, but Lyra's camera, facing the street, had picked up a shadow passing near the hedges around 1:36 a.m. I didn't tell her what I thought, just thanked her, walked her back across the street, and made sure she locked the door. Inside, I pulled the footage and added it to the case folder. They were trying to erase what happened, bit by bit. But I'd worked too many fires, I'd reconstructed too many deaths. I knew exactly what to keep and what to let them destroy. Because sometimes, the absence of something is the loudest piece of evidence you can present. And Corliss was digging a deeper hole with every move she made. The fire marshal's envelope arrived 2 days later. Plain, unmarked, except for my name written in Devrin's handwriting. No return address, no agency stamp. Just a quiet declaration. Someone on the inside didn't want this tangled up in bureaucratic delays. I slid it open at the kitchen counter with the same blade I used to strip copper shielding off wiring during inspections. Inside, a printed summary, 3 thermal stress analysis sheets, and 2 photos of the bolts I'd mailed. Devrin had done more than test them. He'd run a comparative deformation analysis against known structural failure patterns from external ignition events. The results were clear. The bolts had experienced heat exposure consistent with open flame contact at rapid velocity, meaning the fire had traveled to the point of origin. The steel warped outward from an exterior source, not from internal combustion. Devrin's last line hit like a rivet gun. Conclusion: evidence consistent with flame front exposure from lateral source. Recommend further investigation into surrounding structure, suppression system absence, and HOA-approved materials list. It was the sentence I'd been waiting for. I scanned it, watermarked it, backed it up in 3 separate drives, and added it to the active file. But paper alone wasn't going to move the needle. I needed someone on the board to acknowledge what Corliss had done, and that meant Darren Colt. He wasn't at his house when I knocked, only the porch light glowed, motion sensor slow to trigger. I left a sealed manila folder in his mailbox, Devrin's report, a cover note, and a copy of the HOA meeting transcript from the night Corliss claimed there was no connection between structural changes and ignition. No threats, no commentary, just facts. Later that night, my phone buzzed. A restricted number. I answered, waited. Darren's voice came through the static, quiet, like he was calling from a corner of a room no one else was allowed to hear. I read it. He didn't say anything else for a few seconds. I didn't know it was that bad. The bolt melt. External exposure? That can't be coincidence. It isn't. I've been going over the work order logs. There's a code, Project 43B. It's been redacted in the board portal, but it matches the removal timeline of your arbor. Corliss authorized it directly. No vote. My throat tightened. Is that in writing? He hesitated again. Sort of. The access logs still show her credentials, but the actual authorization string was overwritten last week. I only caught it because I archived an old draft of the board agenda on my own system. He paused. I can send it to you. Quietly. No. Send it to the fire marshal's office. Silence. Then, you trust them more than me? I trust you to do the right thing. That means not putting your name in my report. Yet. He sighed, the kind that weighs more than it releases. Look, he said, you didn't hear this from me, but Corliss is holding a closed vote next week to grant retroactive immunity for any emergency beautification enforcement decisions. She's framing it as a way to protect the board from legal distraction. A retroactive shield. She was expecting the hammer to fall and trying to blunt it in advance. How many board members are left on her side? I asked. Darren didn't answer immediately. 2, maybe 3. If I speak up, that changes. I let the line go quiet for a while. You're not just a witness anymore, Darren, I said. You're in it. You decide how deep. The call ended without another word. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I pulled every HOA compliance document I'd archived since moving in. I wasn't going to let them sweep this under ornamental shrubs and vision statements. Because now, I had the fire marshal's findings. I had a board member with guilt in his voice. And I had the moment of truth coming, one vote at a time. I pulled into the Marrow Glen Community Center parking lot at 9:12 a.m., 10 minutes before the HOA's Beautification Subcommittee Meeting was scheduled to begin. On paper, it was a formality, just a session to review upcoming landscape vendor proposals. In reality, it was a smokescreen. Corliss had moved her retroactive immunity vote here, outside the official board calendar, buried in landscaping minutia where no one would look. Except, I was looking. The folder on my passenger seat was heavy, not just with paper, but with weight. Inside, Devron's thermal stress report, the photo evidence of bolt deformation, HOA time-stamped email notices, and now, Darren's redacted work order cache, Project 43B, the quiet code name for the removal of my arbor. I locked the car, grabbed the file, and stepped into the bright Nevada sun. The center's side conference room wasn't large, but the glass wall let sunlight pour in, washing out the cheap projection screen Corliss had set up. She was already there, flipping through notes with a stack of pre-signed ballots tucked beneath her elbow. Mr. Myrick, she said, barely glancing up. This is a closed session. No, it's not, I replied. Marrow Glen bylaws state all subcommittee meetings involving physical alterations to resident properties must remain open to resident observation unless a safety override is declared. No override has been declared. Corliss smiled, tight, annoyed. We're discussing plants. Then you won't mind me listening. She said nothing. I stepped inside. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another, Darren, didn't look up. He just stared at the tabletop, arms crossed. The first 20 minutes passed in vague chatter about trellis repairs and xeriscaping contracts. No mention of fire, no mention of structure votes. I kept my eyes on the file, fingers tapping in rhythm, with each mention of aesthetic continuity. Then she slid it in. We'll close with a procedural housekeeping motion, Corliss said smoothly, to ratify emergency actions taken under Article 9C during the pre-bonfire beautification phase, including adjustments to non-compliant structures. That was it, her retroactive shield, a fast vote, a paper trail that would make the arbor's removal look like a legitimate fire prevention act, when in fact it was the opposite. I stood before the ballots could pass. Before you vote, I said, you should see something. Corliss's jaw flexed. I set the folder down on the table and opened it to the first page. State Fire Marshal's findings, I said, letting the report fan out beneath the projector light. These bolts, tested under controlled conditions, match ignition from an exterior flame source, Not electrical failure, not internal combustion, heat deformation from outside, directional, confirmed. One of the board members leaned in. And here, I said, sliding the next page, you'll find internal HOA logs showing that the structure you voted to remove, my arbor, had a live suppression rig connected to a temperature-sensitive mist system. Removed without vote. No code enforcement. No notice of violation served before dismantling. Corliss opened her mouth, but I cut her off. Project 43B, that was the name you assigned it. Darren? The room turned. He hesitated, then nodded. It's in the logs. It wasn't supposed to be accessed, but I saved the draft. Another silence. Corliss recovered quickly. We acted to preserve neighborhood safety and aesthetic integrity. The materials were in violation of Article 12. The materials were Class A fire rated, I snapped. Yours weren't. I slid the final image forward. A full-color render of the ember trajectory overlaid on the Marrow Glen map, the spark trail arcing from the bonfire to my property, the red crescent of ignition, a single point of contact precisely at the edge of where my mist system had been. You burned my children, I said, with your vanity and your shortcuts. This isn't a vote anymore. This is a timeline. No one moved. The ballot sat untouched. Corliss reached for her notes again, but her hands shook just enough to betray her. Darren finally looked up. He didn't speak. He just folded the first ballot in half and set it aside, unread. By the time I made it home, Darren was already parked across the street. His car sat idling like he couldn't decide whether to leave or step out. I didn't wave, just walked up my porch stairs and unlocked the front door. I left it open behind me. He followed a full minute later. No clipboard, no laptop. Just a small thumb drive in his hand, clenched like something he might throw away if he hesitated too long. I saved everything I could, he said without looking around. Screenshots, backup schedules, file hashes, not just the arbor work order, everything. I nodded once. Project 43B. And the vote manipulation on the digital portal. Corliss retroactively reassigned timestamps on multiple actions to make them look like they'd been approved during prior sessions. But the platform logs back-end credential use. She didn't wipe that part. I led him to the kitchen table. He set the drive down between us like a confession. There's more, he said. I waited. She pressured our IT contractor to scrub audit trails 2 weeks ago. He refused and she threatened to cut his contract. I think he's sitting on a local copy. I haven't contacted him yet. She covering anything besides mine? Yes, 3 other incidents, 2 permit rejections with forged visual inspections, 1 ramp denial that was stamped before any board vote occurred. So, it wasn't just me. My family wasn't the only collateral, but mine had burned. I picked up the drive, plugged it into my offline laptop, and dragged the contents to an encrypted volume. Directory trees scrolled by. Images, log files, timestamp summaries, even message threads with other board members questioning decisions that never made it into minutes. Darren stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the scorched arbor through the glass. I didn't think it would go this far, he muttered. You thought she was just firm. I thought she was trying to protect property values, keep the place from sliding downhill. She set fire to a suppression system in a drought-prone zone. That's not protection. That's negligence with an HOA letterhead. He turned. I know. I turned the screen so he could see the folder index. You still willing to testify? He hesitated. I'll give a deposition, video, if you want, but I can't sit in a courtroom. You won't have to. The fire marshal's going to push this through code enforcement, but if it escalates, if it gets to a civil suit, I'll need you on record. He gave a quiet nod. I'm not doing this for you. I know. I'm doing it because Elson waved to me every morning from that stroller, and I never waved back. We sat in silence for a moment. Let me ask you something, he said, quieter now. Do you think she ever thought it would catch fire? No. I think she thought it wouldn't matter if it did. He closed his eyes for a beat. When he opened them, something had shifted. The guilt was still there, but it had sharpened, hardened into something that might actually do damage. Before he left, he handed me one more thing. A printed copy of the internal proposal Corliss had circulated privately. It wasn't about safety. It was about curb aesthetics. A bullet-pointed vision document for symmetry-enhanced landscape zones. with non-metallic shading structures marked as a priority enforcement item. It was dated 4 days before the removal crew came to my yard. She'd planned it. I filed it next to Deverin's report. Darren walked out without another word, but this time he didn't hesitate at the porch stairs. He walked like a man who just set something on fire behind him and wasn't going back to check if it still burned. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the remaining beam. I didn't light the porch that night. I let the darkness have it. I spent the next 2 days preparing like I was back on a federal scene. Fire patterns, structural data, thermoplastic behavior curves, every piece cataloged, time-stamped, and linked to chain of custody statements. But this time, it wasn't just a report for some insurance dispute. It was a forensic strike against a suburban warlord hiding behind bylaws, and it had to be airtight. I started with the image logs, screenshots of Project 43B's creation and the deletion trails Darren uncovered, then the credential audit logs. Corliss's login sessions all aligned with back-end alterations made hours after regular board votes, each one labeled Emergency Beautification Override. No vote trails, no digital signatures from other members. I pulled the HOA's own bylaws and highlighted Article 9BC, the one she was misusing to justify unilateral actions. Nowhere did it permit removal of structures with active safety function. Nowhere did it allow for decisions outside of recorded meetings without written consent from the board majority. Next came the fire marshal's statement. I paired it with weather data from the day of the fire, wind speeds, directional drift, humidity index. I created a full fire spread animation using open source tools. It showed the ember drift arcing from the HOA's unauthorized bonfire to the spot where my twins had been sleeping. And then I added the final stroke, the thermal imagery. The bolts I'd retrieved side by side, the pre-fire anchors from my shed and the post-fire bolts from the melted remains. Heat bloom differentials, angle of warping, surface microfractures, all proof that fire came from outside, not from anything I installed. When it was done, I compressed everything into a master file, labeled, encrypted, and backed up 4 ways. One to the fire marshal's office, one to a legal contact in Reno who owed me a favor, one to a digital forensics archive I used in my private consulting days, and one on a flash drive I wore on a lanyard around my neck. The prep wasn't just about proving guilt, it was about making sure they couldn't erase it. At 3 a.m., I finally let myself breathe, but only for a moment, because the next step was riskier than evidence. The next step was leverage. I needed a list of homeowners who'd received citations like mine, structures removed without board approval. I had 2 names already from Darren. I wanted 10. So I drove to a part of the neighborhood Corliss rarely visited, the East Side units built near the old irrigation gully, where homes weren't on the glossy flyers. The residents there had complaints too, but they didn't file appeals. They couldn't afford to. One door after another, I introduced myself, told them who I was, told them what happened, told them I was building a case, not just for myself, for every family whose modification, ramp, shade, rail, patio, had been removed without process. By noon, I had 6 more names. 3 of them handed me HOA warning letters they'd kept. One still had photos of the ramp that got pulled while her husband was in hospice. Pattern, negligence, bias in enforcement, all of it is relevant. All of it is admissible if it came to trial. I brought it back to my desk, scanned every paper, and cataloged every name. Added a new folder, Community Impact Statements. Not because I needed them, but because it made the case bulletproof. Because when Corliss tried to spin this as an isolated incident, I'd show it was a pattern of sanctioned harm. Measurable, repeated, documented. The kind of pattern that made attorneys pay attention. I stared at the board's public meeting notice for next week, rebranded as a community wellness forum. She was trying to defuse it. Keep it polite, keep it small. But I wasn't playing small. I wasn't the man who built the arbor anymore. I was the man who was going to bury her in the blueprints of her own lies. 3 nights before the forum, I walked the perimeter of my yard like I used to do at federal fire scenes. Slow, silent, collecting details that most people missed. But this time, I wasn't just observing. I was preparing a trap. The final piece had arrived that morning, a calibrated pressure-activated sensor module, the same model I'd used years ago for warehouse investigations in Colorado. It wasn't for fire. It was for presence. I embedded it into the gravel bed beside the shade arbor beam, just under a thin layer of dry mulch. It would log any pressure over 25 pounds. Human weight. Tampering weight. I angled a secondary IR camera from my garage roof, hardwired into a closed feed. No Wi-Fi, no cloud. I wasn't risking another leak. If Corliss or one of her late-night messengers came back to clean up the mess before the forum, I wanted proof they were still trying to erase me. But it stayed quiet. Until the night before the meeting. At 2:42 a.m., the module pinged. Weight applied, 3 seconds, then off. I reviewed the footage before sunrise. A figure, hooded, slim, no tools, just gloved hands reaching toward the burn beam and stopping. The figure just stood there, one hand hovering above the charred edge of the steel, like they were touching something they didn't understand. Then they turned and walked away. I zoomed, frame by frame. It wasn't Corliss, it was her assistant, Jenna Hallbrook, HOA secretary, always quiet, always the one typing while Corliss talked. And in that moment, she didn't look like someone following orders. She looked like someone trying to see the damage for herself. The next morning, I printed stills, time-stamped, but I didn't add them to the file. Not yet. Because sometimes leverage isn't for attack. Sometimes it's the invitation. At 10:47 a.m., I caught her outside the HOA office trailer behind the clubhouse. "Jenna," I said, flat, direct. She froze like I'd called her by a name she wasn't supposed to hear in public. "Walk with me." She hesitated. But she followed. We walked a short loop past the community garden, half-wilted, underfunded, barely used. I waited until we passed the tool shed before I said anything else. "I know you went to the arbor last night." Her breath hitched. "I didn't touch anything," she said quickly. "I know, that's why I'm talking to you." Silence. "I need someone to confirm the vote suppression," I said, "and the field orders Corliss pushed through, Project 43B. You were in the room when she filed it. I know she used your login." She blinked hard, but didn't deny it. "She said it was temporary," she whispered, "that the files would be restored once the community settled down. She said it was to avoid panic, not to lie." "But it was a lie." She didn't answer. We stopped near the bench under the brittle oak tree at the edge of the dog park. She looked down at her shoes. Dust clung to the edges. "She said we were protecting the neighborhood from chaos," she said, voice small. "But the fire? I didn't think it would get that far." "It didn't get that far. It got to the stroller, fast." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away with too much practiced control. She wasn't weak, just tired of watching everything get twisted under Corliss's rules. "I have your system logs," I said. "I know which machines processed the order. But I need confirmation. Just one signature. You don't even need to testify." She looked at me. Really looked. Like she was weighing something inside her that had no good answer. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "I printed this the night it happened," she said, before she wiped the access trail. "It's not much, just the first draft of the field order. My initials are at the bottom." I took it carefully. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Her voice cracked. "Because I thought maybe I was the only one she lied to." I nodded, slowly. "You're not?" She turned without another word and walked back toward the trailer, her steps quick and uneven, like she didn't trust herself to walk slowly anymore. I unfolded the paper. There it was, dated, time-stamped, draft order, structure removal, field crew instruction, no notice required. Corliss's initials scrawled in red ink. Jenna's in black beneath it, the final nail. And it didn't come from a camera. It came from someone who'd finally had enough of silence. The community center was already half full by the time I arrived. Not the usual trickle of retirees and HOA loyalists who came for coffee and yard gossip. This time, the crowd looked different. Younger, angrier. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet for years were now seated in folding chairs, arms crossed, waiting. They weren't here for shrubs. They were here for blood. Corliss stood at the front, flanked by 2 remaining loyalists on the board. Her hair was perfectly in place, her expression unshaken. She tapped. The microphone once, the sound sharp and shrill in the quiet hall. "Good afternoon," she began, with the same calm tone she always used at these forums. "We appreciate your attendance as we review the recent concerns raised regarding neighborhood safety and beautification policy enforcement." I stepped forward, slow and deliberate, with a black case in my hand. "Before you review anything," I said, "the community deserves to hear what you did." Gasps rippled through the room. Corliss turned toward me, her expression tightening, but still locked in that performative neutrality. "Mr. Myrick," she said, "this is not the time for personal—" "It's exactly the time." I walked past the first row, opened the case, and pulled out the thermal bloom diagram. Mounted, labeled, clear. I placed it on the easel beside the podium. "This is what fire spread looks like," I said. "This is how fast it traveled from the unapproved bonfire you greenlit to where my twin babies were sleeping." Corliss didn't move. I opened the folder next, placed down Deverin's report summary, then the HOA's internal work order showing Project 43B, the final sheet, Jenna's signed draft. She removed a fire-resistant structure with active suppression systems, without vote, without notice, against engineer recommendation. She replaced it with polyurethane-coated timber, flammable at 32 seconds under ember exposure. Someone stood up in the third row, a mother I'd spoken to 2 nights before, the one whose ramp was removed while her husband was on oxygen. "My patio shade was pulled last fall," she said. "They said it was an eyesore. My kids nearly passed out from heat stroke during summer. I filed a complaint, got a silence letter back." Another man stood. "Same with my railing. She called it structurally disruptive to the neighborhood flow." The dam had cracked. Corliss stepped forward, clearing her throat. "These accusations are emotionally charged and deeply unfortunate, but they don't reflect the legally binding actions taken by this board under Article 9C, which allows emergency remediation when safety is—" Darren stood. She forged the timestamp approvals. Corliss turned slow. "Excuse me? You logged into the system after vote deadlines. You reassigned actions to prior board sessions. I archived the logs. They're backed up off-platform." Corliss blinked just once. The room stilled. "I have no idea what he's talking about," she said flatly. "If there were administrative mistakes, they were procedural, not intentional, and they don't connect to Mr. Myrick's tragic loss." "No?" I asked. "Then explain this." I turned the final board around, a screenshot of the order with Jenna's initials, time-stamped 2 days before the structure removal. No vote, no warning, no fire marshal review, just an order to dismantle a suppression structure because it didn't. It matched the HOA's visual language. Voices rose in the back. Someone called her a liar. Another demanded her resignation. She held up a hand, trying to regain control. But it was gone. Gone with the sound of folding chairs scraping back, with homeowners rising to their feet not for applause, but because they'd finally realized the house they paid for had turned into something else. A zone of control. A system of image over safety. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to say another word. Corliss backed away from the podium. Darren picked up the microphone. "As acting vice president," he said, "I motion for a full vote of no confidence in President Gratch." The room roared. Hands shot up. Corliss's last move was a glance at the side door, calculating, cornered, a woman who'd built her castle on code citations, and finally felt the bricks coming loose. And I stood there, silent as the first vote came down like a match across dry timber. The vote passed in under 5 minutes. Out of the 43 homeowners in attendance, 39 raised their hands. The others didn't speak. Even Corliss's usual allies, Brenda Lorick and Dale Trim, kept their hands at their sides, eyes on the floor. When the count was done, Darren didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just set the microphone down and nodded like a man laying a body to rest. Corliss didn't say a word. She picked up her folder, clutched it tight against her chest like it might stop the bleeding, and walked toward the exit. She paused once when she reached the back of the room, maybe expecting someone to follow her, to object, to give her the safety net she always counted on. No one moved. She left alone. I waited until the door closed behind her before I stepped forward. I wasn't here for revenge. I didn't want to see her cry. I wanted clarity and accountability, and something that resembled justice, even if it came in pieces. "Darren," I said, "the files, are they secure?" He nodded. "Everything backed up twice. I've submitted them to the fire marshal and the county code compliance office." "And the override logs?" "Same. I included Jenna's signed draft. Everything." "Good." The room stayed silent, like people were afraid to exhale until someone else made the first move. So I did. I turned toward the crowd, toward the neighbors who'd watched us for months, maybe years, hiding behind fences and small talk. My children didn't die because of a freak accident, I said. They died because someone thought uniformity mattered more than safety. Because a suppression system was removed for not matching a paint swatch. Because a fire code was seen as an inconvenience. No one interrupted. I stepped aside and let the documents speak for themselves. Each board, each photo, each log. I laid out the burn trajectory diagram, the steel bolt comparison, the weather overlay that showed ember drift like a bullet path. This isn't about punishment, I said finally. This is about prevention, because it wasn't just my house, it wasn't just my twins. Some of you lost ramps, shades, railings, not because they were unsafe, but because they didn't fit the aesthetic narrative. People nodded, some slowly, some with their jaws clenched tight. We rebuild from this by refusing to forget it happened, by reviewing every enforcement action taken under Corliss Gratch's presidency, by repealing any bylaw that lets one person override safety in the name of appearance, by making sure no one like her ever holds power in this neighborhood again. Applause didn't come immediately, but it came, not loud, not thunderous, just real. One by one, hands clapped, hesitant, then steady. Then someone stood, then another, and before long, the entire room was on its feet. Not for me, but for themselves. For the moment, they realized they weren't just residents. They were a community. After the forum, people approached in twos and threes. A man handed me photos of his old railing. A woman showed me her violation notice from last year, crumpled and stained from the drawer she'd kept it in. Someone else offered to help fund a legal review of every order tied to Corliss's name. It was starting. The shift. Not just in the bylaws, but in the people. Later that evening, I walked back to my porch. The sky had turned that heavy violet you only get after long heat and a clean break in pressure. The arbor beam still stood, blackened and upright, the names Elson and Rovan carved into the steel. I'd wiped them clean before the meeting. Not because I was letting go, but because they weren't symbols anymore. They were evidence. And from now on, no one would be able to pretend they hadn't seen them. They delivered the certified letter 2 weeks later, stamped from the Office of State Code Enforcement, signed by a senior investigator I didn't know. Inside was a formal notice of violation issued to the Marrow Glen Estates Homeowners Association. It outlined 5 infractions, each backed by evidence Darren and I submitted. Unauthorized structure removal, violation of fire code override policy, unlawful destruction of resident-installed safety systems, fabrication of compliance records, retaliatory citation issuance, the penalty, immediate suspension of the HOA's authority to enforce architectural or safety standards, pending a full audit. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table beside the beam, the same beam that had survived everything. I had planned to remove it after the hearing, but something kept me from touching it. Maybe it was the scorch marks, maybe it was the steel's weight when I rested my hand on it each morning, or maybe it was that carving, Elson and Rovan, still clear beneath the layers of smoke. They weren't just my kids. They were the boundary between what this place used to be and what it could still become. Corliss never returned to her position. After the vote, she cleaned out the HOA trailer in the early hours and moved out within days. No warning, no statement, just gone. The house went up for sale without a name on the listing. I didn't care about watching her leave. I cared that she couldn't erase what she did. The neighborhood had changed. You could feel it in the small things. People nodded longer when you passed them on the street. More backyard lights stayed on at night. Someone repainted the community bench near the park where Elson used to feed birds with me. They added a plaque. It didn't mention the fire. It just said they mattered and still do. Darren stayed on as acting president until a special election. He didn't want the job, but no one else trusted anyone but him. Jenna submitted a statement to the audit committee voluntarily. She never said another word to me, but she didn't need to. Everyone had said what mattered. At dusk, I stood on the porch and watched the sun bleed gold across the gravel. The air smelled clean for once. No plastic, no oil, no synthetic mulch. Just dust and the last trace of summer. My porch camera still rolled, not out of fear now, out of habit. I'd replace the MIST system not because it would ever be used again the same way, but because it was right. I reinforced the arbor's base, sealed the steel, left the beams standing, but I changed the carving. It didn't say Elson and Rovin anymore. Now it read, "They won't burn us twice." If you've lived through HOA abuse, if you've been silenced, fined, or threatened for protecting your family, you're not alone. They count on your silence, they depend on your compliance. But the moment you document, the moment you share, the moment you gather the pieces and show the pattern, they fall. One policy, one vote, one neighbor at a time. And if you want to see more stories where the ones in power finally get exposed, where the people with nothing left find a way to fight back, subscribe now. Because the fire may have taken what I loved most, but it gave me a truth that can't be extinguished.